Tēnā koutou, I'm Selwyn Manning, and welcome to A View from Afar. And today, in the second episode of A View from Afar for 2023, political scientist Dr. Paul Buchanan and I will analyse the question, how stable is the Russian Federation President Vladimir Putin's regime? We'll also look at this question from a number of angles, and we will also reveal some shifts within the regime's control structure that may come as a surprise to many in the West, including experts in their field. Paul will deep dive, for example, into the dynamics between the mercenary Wagner Group's commander Prigozhin and his relationship with Putin, the Kremlin, and the estrangement from Russia's military generals and Putin appointees. And also what is going on there. What is Prigozhin's endgame? Does he have the support of Putin, or is this support conditional on successes as they may define them in the Ukraine front line? And I will also have a segment where I will dig into the pillars of power in the Russian Federation, and in particular, these four areas. Putin as the head of Russian political might, if you like, from a personalised autocracy point of view, the Putin-era oligarchs compared to the Yeltsin-era oligarchs, and there's significant differences to be held there, and the Russian state military, and also the rise of private armies and militia, and those are the pillars of power that we're identifying there. Then Paul will take us contextually and also comparatively through all of this complexity so that we can more accurately assess the big question, and that once again is how stable is Putin's regime. Okay, before we cross to Paul, here's an invitation to those of you who are live with us now as we record A View from Afar, and I can see that there are a number of you already that are making comments. Thank you for that. Now I say, feel free to interact with us while we are live on YouTube or Facebook, although YouTube is probably the best, as Facebook, as it does, is continually undergoing changes in that space. And remember, if you do make comments or lodge questions, your interaction may be included in this broadcast. Okay, so got a program to deliver, and let's cross to Paul to dig down into these deep, big issues that are confronting the world at this very time. Tēnā koe, Paul. Paul, yeah, so with that introduction all done, you know, what are you assessing at the moment as the most dominant indicators of what is happening inside the Russian Federation, and certainly, you know, from the point of view of that frontline conflict that has been going for a long time now?
Well, what we're seeing is the makings of a power struggle between the Kremlin and various contenders for power. This is a very dangerous moment for Vladimir Putin, and it's only going to get worse for him in the months to come if he manages to make it for the next few months. And I say that without, hyperbole, without exaggeration. And the reason for that is because the head of the Wagner Group, Yevgeny, what is his name? Prigozhin.
Oh, yeah.
Anyway, I'm mangling that. But anyway, that guy, Prigozhin, that's
yeah.
it. He's now directly challenging Putin about the war. And we'll get into, the dangers of allowing a private military company's leader to challenge state authority when it comes to prosecuting the war. But let's think of it this way. Under normal circumstances in Russia, a challenge like this would be met by death. The person issuing the challenge would be assassinated or killed off. Prigozhin has an insurance policy because without Wagner, the Russians cannot defeat the Ukrainians. The Russians need Wagner in order to succeed, even when it comes to limited territorial goals. So Prigozhin has a formidable insurance policy because Putin needs him. It's increasingly obvious that he doesn't need Putin. And what's incredible is that not only is he apparently contending for the job of defense minister to replace Sergei Shoigu, who this Prigozhin criticized. Well, he's called for Shoigu to be put to death. I mean, this guy is hard case.
And I think the translation was eat the innards of the dead Wagner soldiers.
And yeah. I mean, you've seen the videos of him posing in front of his dead soldiers. But what's interesting is for Putin, this is a self-made problem because under Russian law, private military corporations are illegal. Mercenaries are illegal, and yet one of the biggest buildings in St. Petersburg is the Wagner headquarters. So, for some reason, and we'll elaborate on this, Putin has allowed the existence of apparently more than one private military corporation. And here's the fundamental problem. One of the core functions of the state, if you take Max Weber's definition of the state, is a monopoly over organized violence or organized coercion within given territorial limits. The state is the repressive apparatus, not these private guys, because it's a core measure of sovereignty. And Putin has ceded sovereignty to Wagner, I guess, in exchange for protection at home, and then allowed Wagner to go off abroad and get involved. For example, Wagner provides security services for gold mining and diamond mining in sub-Saharan Africa, most of whose investors are Chinese. This is blood; these are blood diamonds. This is blood gold, but it's Wagner that secures those assets. Wagner is in Libya. Wagner is in Syria. They're $1 billion enterprise. And I guess the original agreement was you do your thing abroad, and in case anyone turns on me being Putin, you come to my rescue. Well, Prigozhin knows that. Prigozhin now realizes that he's in the catbird seat, and he wants Shoigu out. I mean, he wants him dead. And what's interesting is that not only is his insurance policy at this point ironclad, but he has now moved into the realm, and you'll talk about this, of criticizing Russian economic elites. And just today, he gave an interview that was extraordinary in its bluntness. And basically, what he said, and it reminded me of criticisms about the rich Americans dodging the Vietnam War back in the day. It was the poor and people of color who went to Vietnam, not the upper middle class and the rich. Um, Prigozhin has pointed out that the sons and daughters of the elites are holidaying in Dubai, are living in London, are not sacrificing for their country. That the people who are sacrificing for their country are working class Russian men who have been conscripted in because they can't escape. They don't have the money for airplane tickets. They cannot get out. And so while intellectuals and artists and the sons and daughters of the rich escape Russia, it's left to, what's left of their middle class and, the working classes to prosecute this war. And that's part of the reason why Wagner's had to recruit from prisons, because there simply are not enough of them. Well, Prigozhin's line was this. It's, if you keep up this path where you shelter the rich from the pain of the poor in fighting your war, then we're in a pre-revolutionary movement. This is pre-1917, and he actually used that analogy, which in Russia, to say it resonates is an understatement. He's now bringing the specter of 1917 to Vladimir Putin and saying, if you don't start doing something about the rich kids shirking their patriotic duty, our soldiers, your soldiers, will turn on you, and you don't know where my loyalties lie. I mean, that's just it. He's like, if your troops turn on you, because this war is in fact strengthening Ukraine. He made the point, he goes, if Ukraine had 1,000 tanks before the war, now it has 10,000 tanks. If Ukraine had 200,000 men who knew how to shoot before the war, now it has 1 million men who know how to shoot. I mean, he basically said the whole war is backfired. And his prescription is not one that you and I would share. He's like, we got to go medieval. We got to go full totalitarian, close down Russia, impose a North Korean style dictatorship, and then lay waste to the Ukraine. That's the only way out of this other than defeat. Well, I'll tell you, there can be no more blunt a challenge than what's just been offered. So what I would say is this. In Russia, we see this power play exposing the fractures within the elite as well as between the elite and the masses of Russians. And Prigozhin is trying to exploit those fractures to his own advantage. And by being an ultra-nationalist, he's going to attract attention on the right of the Russian political spectrum away from Putin. Putin's having trouble now recovering the hardliners. And that spells trouble for Putin, because if any of Prigozhin's prognosis turns out to be correct, what we're seeing is exactly what he said. I wouldn't say it's a pre-revolutionary movement, but it is a pre-coup or a pre-revolt movement. And the question then is, how much loyalty does Putin have when push comes to shove?
Yeah, that's an interesting kind of thing there about, whether or not it's pre-rebellion in a sense, because it looks like we could easily define what we've seen in the last few weeks, and particularly overnight, what you've alluded to there at the end of what you just said, as revolt, if you like, or a disengagement. But the other parts that you raised are dovetailing into what I've been looking at too, Paul, in the sense that inside Russia, it appears that those demographics, those groups that most support the conflict against Ukraine, have been those that it doesn't actually overlap to. That it's definitely not popular amongst the poor and that those, and particularly the younger generations, that can be drafted and conscripted and sent over in whatever form, whether or not it's within the state military or over here with the private militias. Also, there's been a deal basically that has been going on since last year, that those that are sent to fight in Ukraine, that their families back home benefit from money, that the father or the brother or the significant male in the house, that for the first time in many of these families' lives, they're actually earning money. And this seems to be something that is showing through, that they're actually earning more money for their families than they ever could within an ordinary working life. And the other factor is that the children and the wives or the nuclear family of people that are sent into combat are benefiting from stability, that income continues even if the person is killed in action in the Ukraine conflict. And also beyond that the children of these families have the right to go to Russian universities without having to front up to exams. And so while the guy is over there fighting, he knows, if I die, my family is looked after. And those in the poorer regions have been one of the seems to be one of the deals of maintaining some sense of cooperation while the mood against this conflict in Ukraine is in evidence. And the mood is something that it seems, when you look into the political scientists and how they're measuring what the public views are on conflict, because it's outlawed for a person to say they are against the conflict. There are questions that are being able to be measured where, what's the mood of the people in your community? Those around you, that kind of mood. What are they supporting? What are they not? How anxious are they is another thing that doesn't touch on necessarily the conflict in Ukraine or the decisions to go into Ukraine and commit war. But it gives an idea of how more anxious are you now compared to when let's say February 2022. These kind of things and measures are being used, and while the political scientists inside Russia that are now in exile are saying it's a little bit like grasping in the dark, these are the measures that they're left with. So let's put that away. Some of the pillars of power that we said at the front end that we'd just quickly look at, that's so that you can see where Paul and I are coming from in the rest of this podcast. And Putin, as the head of Russia's state, his leadership and the actual state, the Russian government, if you like, is being defined by those political scientists within Russia that are now in exile as personalised autocracy. And they're spitting that as a difference here, and it's quite an interesting difference, that when you've got an autocracy that might have a one-party state, like perhaps over in the People's Republic of China, the actual party apparatus itself, it can deal with succession. It can deal with a leader falling over. It's got those, we can see the difficulties, but they've got some sort of line of succession that would happen in different events. And in Putin's Russia, that does not exist. The other thing that is identifiable when you look into this is that the bureaucracies of government, they're pretty tokenist when you start looking under the lid a little bit further. And what you see there too, and it dovetails into an examination of the oligarchs. I think in the West, there's a perception that the oligarchs, they own these major, once were state corporations. They're just making their billions. Well, yes, they're making billions, but the Yeltsin era oligarchs own the assets. The Putin era oligarchs, they own the right to procurement and engage with the Russian state on procurement. So they're around the table and they're there at the behest. Putin basically is the one who controls who gets what as far as in business with the Russian state and who has the right for procurement advantages. And so that changes the perception, if you like, of that pillar of power in the West, where we think, well, the oligarchs won't put up with a lot of this for too much longer. They're not able to get back to business. Well, that's not necessarily the case when you look at the structure as it is now compared to the Yeltsin era oligarchs. So this putting that in there from a context too. The Russian state military, it's an interesting one. Since post-World War II, even with the purges of Stalin, etc., that the general public had a deal with their government, their leaders, where, if we keep out of your power plays, we understand you keep out of our lives. And if things go wrong, if things start to overlap and the boot of the state starts to absolutely destroy the people, that military will come in to save us. And I guess in some ways, you could see that in play when the Soviet Union fell and the Russian state military shifted its allegiance to where things were heading as opposed to things of the past, in part. Then there's the rise now, like Paul has identified, the rise of the private armies and the militias, and the corporations within the Russian Federation have been building up private armies, militias under their own umbrellas, and Gazprom and others have a significant private army. And of course, what's notorious, infamous around the world is the Wagner Group that is built out of, and is being commanded by a guy that was an oligarch, basically, that had some sort of friendship relationship with Vladimir Putin all of those years ago when he was leading as a chef and owned businesses in that space. Goes into the mercenary business, and we see the evidence of that. So those are where we're coming from. What I'll do too in the YouTube descriptions of this when it's finished is I'll put some links to a couple of political scientists that are in exile. For example, a lot of the work I've been talking about just here has been delivered by Russian political scientist that's in exile now in Europe because she's regarded as a Western agent. And her name is Ekaterina Schulman, and she's got an amazing, in English, she's delivered an amazing lecture on all of these and goes into the depth at Sciences Po in Paris. That's most recent, so I'll put a link to that for those that want to follow through on all of this. Paul, back to you. That's the context. That's what we've been observing as the shifting tiers of power and leadership. I should say that the grandparent generation, 60 and above, they support pretty much the conflict in Ukraine. Doesn't affect them personally unless they see their young grandchildren, going off to fight and that thing. The parent generation, so from around that 40 years of age up to that grandparent thing, they're saying, okay, this is paraphrasing, of course, but they're kind of saying, okay, Putin, we understand you must have your reasons for going into this conflict. Just get it done. We've had enough of it. And then there's the younger generation, and they've got when you dig into their values too, they're no different than the Western people in that age group, 18 to say 30, 35 even, and they're saying, the things that are in existence with those that are in power, they don't represent us. We've had enough of this. We want it to stop. We don't want to be a part of it. And I suppose in some ways, in the spring roundup of those conscription that happens in Russia traditionally around spring, We saw last year a mass exodus of those that were draft dodgers, basically going over the border into Georgia, which Putin has put measures in to stop it this year. But there was also a spike in anxieties within the mood of the country at that time, and certainly within those age groups and demographics that are having a hard time and coming to terms with what their country is committed to in the Ukraine war. So, Paul, those are the main things that pop out. No doubt that it just helps in where we're going. I'll pass it back over to you to pick up the relevancies and perhaps intersect comparatively and contextually on where we all are with this.
Yeah, sure. As an immediate issue, I think that because the question of polling in Russia is so fraught, you can't get reliable polls. In fact, polling is a risky business, depending on the questions you ask. One of the best polls about Russia is to poll people who have left. The fact is their intellectual class, which includes engineers and scientists and what have you, they're leaving in droves. And it would be interesting to canvass them in different countries and get their mood, say what's going on at home. The other aspect is interestingly, and I tend to agree with your demographic survey of who's for the war and who's against it, with a caveat. The first one is that Russian schools have gone full neo-fascist when it comes to so-called civics education. This is all about, Putin, the patriotic war, the Russian Orthodox Church, the defense of traditional values. I mean, it's full on because he doesn't have faith that children left to their own devices will not, once they become teenagers and young adults, oppose him. So he's got mind washing going on an industrial scale with Russian children. The trouble is there are less Russian children than in previous eras because of the demographic decline occurring in Russia. The other part is that I do think that a lot of the people who came of age after the fall of the Soviet Union, so that decade when Yeltsin ruled and then right before Putin came to power, that was, and I'm about to comment more analytically about it, that was the age of incipient democracy. That was the freest age in Russia. And I think some of them, not all of them, but some of them sort of yearned for not the unruliness, but for the freedoms they had, which included freedom to make money if you were well connected. All of this augurs poorly for Putin because the demographic that he wants to serve in this war is either not interested in serving, or, again, given the population shrinkage, are increasingly running out of bodies to serve as cannon fodder. You said it. The older people aren't going to go. They may worry about their grandkids, but again, not if they're rich.
They
So,
need the urban centres, to dip into that. They've kept their hands off.
oh yeah, no, I mean it's very clear. I mean, I know Wagner better than Russian conscription laws and whatnot, but I know that Wagner says to people, they get them out of prison, and they say, look, if you manage to survive the war, you walk free, and we give you a survivor's bonus. We'll help your family while you're fighting, and the operative term is if you survive. Now, Wagner has said that they lost 20,000 troops in the battle for Bakhmut. Prigozhin has said, and so you can magnify that 10 times for the Russian forces. Before the Russians retreated, they were taking casualties like crazy. The interesting thing that people have to understand strategically is that Wagner fought for Bakhmut because Putin needed it to save face. Most Russian troops are on the land bridge between Mariupol and Crimea, and in Crimea. They have spent the last year digging fortifications to make it more difficult for the Ukrainians to advance down towards the Sea of Azov and the Black Sea. So the Russians have been down south. Wagner's been fighting in the east with some Russian units. And so there is a reserve still for the Russians, but they're running out of men and munitions, and they can't afford to bring people over from the eastern force They have about 1,500,000 troops in the Far East. They don't feel that they can bring the land component of the Eastern forces over because they don't trust the Chinese. I mean, it's as simple as that. The Russians, for all they're playing footsie with the Chinese right now, they don't trust them. Many people seem to think that these guys are in bed together. They've always been wary of each other. Now, the
Yeah,
broader issue is
look at those border areas in eastern Siberia, as they overlap down there with China. Now there's a lot of talk. It's from this distance, it's difficult to see where the facts lie, but there's a lot of talk about two-way appeasement that is going on those border regions, but evidence that China is starting to actually make moves on accessing reserves that it didn't used to access. And that's an interesting thing. This is a question too, exactly before we move on, that came in from David Mooring, who's regular, and good on you, David, for being here. And I can see that the people that are in the YouTube channels are certainly being able to interact with David's questions as we go through. And one of the things he's saying here, Paul, is how long can the Russian economy sustain the widow benefits, if he put it in that term, and it's a good way of referring it, I guess. And like we know from the United States is, policy of war inside Iraq and Afghanistan, things are extremely costly on the lead state. We see, even from the point of view of domestic economy, and stresses on the United States after the years after that war. You saw, for example, the infrastructure problems become a political policy situation that is significant within the United States political argument or narrative. So all of these stresses, the costs of war is obviously huge. Russia's not excluded from that. Where we're looked at in behind this question leading into this episode was, where is the economy? Are the sanctions hurting? And without going down that line too deeply, I'll just make an observation that the Russian private sector, the banks, the economic sectors, the trading sectors, they've adapted very, very quickly and seem to be quite agile on their feet with being able to chase where the mega profits are. Russia, in that sense, and it contributes 1/3 of the Russian economy overall. Russian state, obviously, not doing so well. So this may dovetail into our observations that Paul's speaking to too, on the protection of private armies wrapped around these corporations. Just making that from the point of view of cost and being able to sustain, how can the Russian economy sustain the widow's benefits? Yeah, that's a question that's not unanswered, but that's where the values are, is in the private sectors. There's a third grey area that they're referring to, not necessarily criminal, but where it's difficult for them to define, that are under the radar trade, the domestic trade that's going on and that's doing reasonably well, although with the constraints, obviously, that are there due to sanctions and showing up in that part. So just putting that one there in response to David. Paul, back to you on making case here on our question on how stable the regime is.
Yeah, so I mean, the issue of widows' benefits and whatnot is actually really simple. As long as the sanctions regime is being regularly violated, and they're accruing money from the export of crude and natural gas, then there should be no issue. I mean, widows' benefits at best are $1,000 by Western standards. They're nickel and diming, so they're not going to break the Russian bank by giving benefits to widows and families. I mean, it's really small chump change by Western standards. So I wouldn't worry about that.
A bit goes a long way. Yeah. A bit goes a
Yeah,
long way.
yeah. I mean, these people live the standards of living that are way below Western standards to begin with. And again, the sanctions regime, it is hurting the Russian economy, but not to the point that it's going to break it. There's enough countries that are violating the sanctions regime, to include countries like India, ostensibly neutral in the conflict, who are rapidly buying crude at discounted prices. The Chinese, of course, are foremost amongst them. So I don't really see that as a problem. Now, with regards to the broader picture, and I think this is important to understand, during the era of the Soviet Union, the Russian Communist Party, the Soviet Communist Party, it ruled in the following manner, which is the way all one-party authoritarian states do. And it addresses the question of succession, as you well mentioned. But let me elaborate a little bit. The three pillars of one-party authoritarian regimes are the military, the party, and the bureaucracy. They all, serve together. They overlap. They have a symbiotic relationship. So the senior management of the military and the bureaucracy are senior party members, and that's where they reproduce the succession of prime ministers, party leaders, and the like. Any conflicts between party elites is resolved well before they get to the seats of power. They rub each other out at the middle manager levels. And in the case of the military, they often have parallel lines, a political line and then a professional line, where the professional soldiers ultimately have to subordinate themselves to the political soldiers, but the political soldiers don't interfere with the profession of arms. Um, One party authoritarian states are, by and large, in the modern era, the most successful of the authoritarian states. I mean, we have these personalist dynasties like the Saudis, but quite frankly, it's a medieval throwback. The Saudis, in part, are propped by foreigners who run their bureaucracy, their military. If you go and look at the Saudi military, the trainers, all the people know what they're doing are Westerners. So these personalist or family dynasties are nowhere as stable as one-party authoritarian states. But what happens in Russia? The Soviet Union falls, and then we get into a decade or so of what might be called disorderly or unstable quasi-democracy. It was never fully democratic in the 90s, but things opened up. But then there was a lolly scramble by bureaucrats, as you mentioned, who leveraged their positions in the state bureaucracy, using those positions to enrich themselves. That was the Yeltsin oligarchy. And then they were followed by Putin's crowd, who came in and said, okay, this is too degenerate, and we need to impose some discipline, first internally, and then in terms of our foreign affairs. So it was the reversal of perestroika and glasnost. That's the big irony. We remember perestroika and glasnost, which was the opening of Russian society and a thawing of relations with the West. Well, now it's been reversed under Putin. And under Putin, though, and this is where it comes central to the point we're making today, he did not go back to a one-party authoritarian state. He instead has turned Russia into a personalist autocracy that uses rigged elections as a legitimating cover, if you will. It's called electoral authoritarianism, but in his case, it's highly personalistic. If you look at other electoral authoritarians, let's say Viktor Orban in Hungary, there are other parties that contest. He is the head of a party, and he rigs his elections and what have you, but it gives the appearance of contestation for power. In Russia, there's no illusion. If you get anywhere close, I forget the guy, Navalny, who's now,
Yeah. Excellent documentary on that, on Doc Play, that people can access in New Zealand and other states. Well worth it. It was obviously the one that won at the Oscars in the documentary space. Just giving that underscore there.
But here's the deal with Putin, and you and I have talked about this at some length about other dictators. When you're a personalist dictator and you're actually not really interested in differences of opinion and what have you, you start surrounding yourself by yes men, by people. What is it they say in Russia? There's 500 people, the so-called hard men, that Putin has surrounded himself with. You're not getting honest feedback loops about what's going on, with regards not only to your personal status, but feedback loops with regards to the policies that you're enacting. Moreover, when you're a personalist dictator and you're installing cronies in that triumvirate of party, bureaucracy, and the military, and then you strip out the party as an effective mechanism for reproduction of whatever it is your ideology is, then you're basically putting incompetence. And you and I have talked about the fact that when a general becomes the minister of health and starts getting side, kickbacks from contracts from pharmaceuticals, he's no longer leading soldiers in the field. It dulls the edge of the knife, if you will. And that's exactly what's happened in Russia. The Russian military leadership is profoundly corrupt and incompetent, which is why Wagner is in the picture. I think part of the reason why Putin has relied on PMCs is because his military's bloated and corrupt. And Putin knows it, but they're loyal to him. And that's all he's interested in. But now he's not seeing the terrain the way Prigozhin sees it. And I actually
This is
think
interesting.
Prigozhin has a better read. And one last point here. So the regime dynamics under Putin are bad for him. He can hang on using intense repression, but that's a short-term solution, quite frankly. The other thing, and the final thing I'll say in this little brief, is we had the so-called attack on the Kremlin by 2 drones. U.S. intelligence is reporting that they think that it was a Ukrainian special forces unit that did that, but it did it from inside of Russia, because the drone that was used couldn't have come from Ukraine, had a small payload. So it was a symbolic gesture. But if that is true, and the Americans believe it is, then I find it very unlikely that the Ukrainian Special Forces unit, as small as it may have been, can go in deep into Russia outside of Moscow and launch this attack without any help from any Russian. And that brings up the second part. In the past 48 hours, we've had something called the Russian Liberation Front or Legion or something. Russians who are fighting on the side of Ukraine went back into Russia and took over a couple of towns on the border and held them for 48 hours in a classic raid, a demonstration.
Tell us more about that and what it means. Because a lot of the people that are watching this, listening to it, will pick up the hard news element of that. Let's put it into a context of what that means.
Well, that they staged the raid, given the fact that they've been fighting with the Ukrainians against their compatriots for over a year. I mean, these Russians, they estimate there might be 5,000 of them, which is not insignificant in the scheme of things. Well, it tells you that ideologically, there are some people who are willing to take up arms against Putin's forces within Russia. They're just honing their skills on the behalf of the Ukrainians, but now they've gone in and done this raid. Well, raids can vary from 30 minutes to about 72 hours. But a raid is defined as you go in, you have no logistical tail. You sustain yourself behind enemy lines, and then you bugger off. That's exactly what these guys did. Spent 48 hours or so. Now, apparently today, they're hitting some other town. So they're, doing that, death by 1,000 cuts,
I find it interesting too with this group that they appear to be from those eastern areas, east of the Donbass, in part, and that they're Russian speaking as opposed to Ukrainian speaking. Now there's something perhaps that to be made from this, that they are the ones that Russia had said are the separatists that have been fighting in Russia's interests since 2014 in those areas. So if this observation is accurate, and you'll point out if you feel it is, that has a significance too, doesn't it? In the sense that they have witnessed perhaps the same issues that Prigozhin has been ramming down people's throats from the Wagner Group perspective. That maybe it's broader, that there's some sort of militia coalition that is forming. If so, in a smaller part, we saw this kind of thing happening in the conflicts in North Africa, just as there are differences, but when Libya fell, and the warlords all around there that have been used by the West in some ways to create change, started to form their own coalitions of power, and some didn't, and some, the bloodshed went on, and ISIS formed eventually out of that mess. But we without going down that, Paul, there are comparisons to the dangers, perhaps, that what the established Putin regime is actually seeing right now in these last 24, 48 hours.
Yeah, so let's back up and clarify, both tactically and then, more in terms of the power struggle. The Russian intelligence proved to be either incompetent or they lied to Putin because they said that eastern Ukraine would rise up and welcome the Russian troops in, that the separatists would then join the Russian troops in their advance on Kiev and western Ukraine. That happened in small places, but it didn't happen everywhere in the Donbass region. And instead, what happened was Russian speaking Ukrainians, ethnic Russians, turned against the Russians. That when push came to shove, many Russian Ukrainians decided they prefer quasi democratic Ukraine over Putin's Russia. Those who are fighting with this legion are those people. The people, not the separatists who supported Russia after 2014, but Russian Ukrainians who don't want a bar of Putin's Russia. And they say this, but they're not the only guys in these raiding parties. The raiding parties have Russians, as in native Russians, who defected from Russia, joined the Ukrainian International Legion, fought with them, and are now have been given enough operational latitude to stage their own raids, and they're given equipment.
So this is the unspoken part of the Russian demographic. If you look at the demographics by ethnicity in the Russian towns, cities, right across the outer regions, through Siberia, right through into the cities, in some of those cities, you've got 20% that are of Ukrainian ethnicity. Now, this is something that in part can perhaps dovetail into an explanation of this element of what you're talking about.
Yeah, I mean, what's interesting is tactically, I just wanted to leave this as an aside, not to, play strategist. It also shows you the contrast between Ukrainian military strategy and Russian military strategy. The Ukrainians are so confident. They're doing a war of maneuver. Everything they do is based on mobility, rapid action, get out of the way when the other force is massed against you. It's Western in orientation, but it's very modern, very American in its application. The Russians are all about mass, fortifications, putting a lot of tanks in one place, that sort of thing. The Ukrainians have gotten so good at this that they feel confident to let these Russians have some equipment and go to it across the border. Why? Because there's no Ukrainian crossing the border. If Putin wants to make a problem out of this, say, well, look at what these guys basically are insurgents, Russian insurgents inside of Russia. So you're going to have to live with that. I think it's brilliant. I think it's absolutely brilliant because it also disperses Russian forces who now have to come back from the Ukraine to try to get these raiders out. See, they've moved their forces away from the border because they don't want to get bombed, by the Ukrainian Air Force or by drones. And so they're 100 miles away, deeper into Russia, and now they're getting hit by this Russian legion. You've got to pull troops from the Donbass to go chase these guys down. And of course, these guys disappear. I mean, it's hit and run warfare at its finest. And what's interesting, because they are Russians, there have been no civilian casualties. The Russians claim a woman was killed while evacuating. So she was not killed by direct fire. And we can't trust anything the Russians say anyway. But the issue is they're trying to avoid civilian casualties. And I would argue the fact that they've held towns for 48 hours indicates to me that at least there is some passivity on the part of the local population. I'm not saying they're welcoming these Russian raiders back into Russia, but they're not opposing them. They're not taking up arms or throwing rocks at them.
Or not able to, would be the other way, perhaps, of looking at that. Yeah.
You never know. Now, the bigger issue is this. This is a problem for Putin. Why? Because there are people inside of Russia who are willing to take up arms against his regime. And if we add that, the fact that there was drone attacks on the Kremlin, the fact that there are these raids, And then we add in the fact that Putin supporters are being assassinated in significant numbers. Car bombs, shootings, bombs in pubs. They're starting with like the periphery of those 500 so-called hard men and killing bloggers, killing propagandists. But they started to hit some of his inner circle, catching them, outside of their homes and whatnot. There is an armed opposition inside of Russia. It may be very, very small,
Yeah,
but if he
because
can't
was
stamp that out,
there's a lot of questions at each event, and people are saying who benefits from this, and sometimes things are so smoky, so foggy, it's difficult to actually answer that question. So when we saw the drones come across, there was a lot of examination on, was that a black flag actually that the Kremlin was involved with in some way? If there was benefit for the Putin regime, and in what capacity? Likewise with the assassination of various people within the Putin umbrella, if you like, of benefit being rubbed out, to put it bluntly. Who benefits from that? If Putin, for example, is sitting there and he's thinking, right, neither the military, the private armies in part, or the population, certainly the private business, are not on board with our reasons for going into Ukraine. But if we create a situation where everybody accepts, amongst all of those pillars of power within Russia, that we're in a defensive response now, that the war has been taken to us, then we can tap into the national pride that has been deep into the Russian DNA, relating to, we pushed out the Nazis in the 1940s. We won the war for the West by taking Berlin. We did this, and the whole kind of thing about the Russian army once again can defend the motherland. Or interesting, in Putin's years, they refer to it more from Putin's side of things as the fatherland, as a side tangent. But, that kind of situation could lead to, even if it wasn't a black flag, even if this is legitimate uprising, even if these attacks that are happening inside Russia are not of a size that can replace a regime, maybe Putin can turn that to his advantage and creating a defense narrative as opposed to an attack narrative. So just, all of these kind of considerations are out there. All of these types of things would in that case would make sense if there was internal instability to the degree where the military itself would be looking at making some sort of change, and perhaps that would then explain the regime taking that particular line. But having said all of that, Paul, getting back to this issues relating to, if we were looking at this from what we are witnessing in the last week, and we placed it on a timeline of expectation, would you see that building up to a point where it has a momentum that can't be arrested? That you even analysing what has happened to other major regimes around the world in the past, do you get a sense that Putin's Russia, or Putin himself under a personalised autocracy, that things can change? And if change did happen, does that look like chaos? Because there are no clear, defined opportunities for leadership succession, even in the absence of an ideology, in a sense. What does that look like post-Putin Russia? What does post-Putin Russia look like?
Well, let me start off by saying that only the stupidest, most reactionary and ignorant elements of the Russian population would think that the drone attacks on the Kremlin are in any way akin to the Nazi invasion of Russia, that this has somehow become a defensive war. That is absolutely ludicrous. And I don't think anybody in the know is buying that for a second. And part of that is because, by the way, the drone was Turkish. The drone is one of these very cheap Turkish models that have a limited range up to 350 kilometers. Again, very small payloads. Um, yeah, he may
I
have
think
tried.
I might not have put it in the way. If all of this create in an appropriate way, if all of this creates an impression where the Russian state has to defend itself, then it can tap into, arguably, this is the arguments that are coming out of Russia. Then it can tap into that national pride that's wrapped around successes in defence in the past. That's what I was mainly getting at, as opposed to the minute, like the drone type of thing, et cetera, et cetera. It's the
Right.
overall narrative. Yeah.
Well, they can try it. I mean, in my work, again with the stupidest people, but the fact is these attacks are against Putin's people. It's not against the Russian people. They're all focused on the regime itself, and I think that's the symbolism. It's like we don't have a quarrel with Russians per se, whoever these folk are, and I happen to think this is part of this armed insurrection that is building. But there's another important aspect to this. I have a feeling that Wagner is involved with this internal insurrection, that it is providing either material or cover for these insurgents. And then when you talk about the Great Patriotic War, I think, yeah, and that's why Prigozhin came up with 1917. The only thing that beats defeating the Germans in the Russian historical narrative is the 1917 revolution, and he went there. And I think he did it thinking along your lines, going, you know what? I'm going to preempt this BS about how we were now on the defense and what have you, and go straight to 1917. I see Wagner's, hand behind a lot of these
Mm.
things. The key point, I think, for our discussion is that the backdrop is Putin's regime is fragile. Okay, Putin's regime, it may not be a paper tiger, it may not be a tin horse, but it is not as strong as it wants to look like or look to be.
Mm.
Certainly, Wagner knows that. So that's the backdrop. And now these probes, because think of insurrections, these sort of not just the raids, but as probes to the regime's capacity to defend itself. And at some point, and I think, you know, from my experience dealing with guerrilla warfare types in Latin America, the idea is you probe and see if you get a popular response that's in your favor. So if people rat you out and tell the army where you are, well, you're not popular. But if you start hitting towns and people get out of your way, or better yet, start giving you water, giving you food, then you know that the regime's support, at least in those areas, is tenuous at best and is limited to the coercive power of the military and has no ideological basis. At the end of the day, everything is about ideology. You either support the regime or you support the opponents, but you can't have it both ways. And if the force that is being applied to these villages in response to the raids runs counter to what their belief systems are, then he's in serious trouble in those borderlands. And I think that's what they're doing. And I think Wagner's involved. And the reason I say Wagner's involved, we forgot to mention this last week when we just alluded to today's session. You may remember, as part of that U.S. airman's leak of classified information, one of the leaks was astounding. It turns out Prigozhin approached President Zelensky of the Ukraine and said, if you allow us to take the center of Bakhmut, I will tell you where Russian positions are throughout the east and south. It's a straight
Now,
trade. Let us
concerned
look
with
good.
his own longevity relating to that, Prigozhin denied anything very, very quickly, didn't he? Even the Ukrainians started to put a plug in that leaky bucket. So, it's an interesting observation as to whether or not if there's truth in it, then that speaks, that's treason with a capital T, isn't it, from the Russian side of things?
But he's got that insurance policy. Again, it's a mercenary. It's a mercenary company. It's a private military company. It's Russian in origin, and it's headquartered in Russia, but it is not necessarily loyal to the regime. Prigozhin can be a Russian nationalist, but he may not be as loyal to Putin as he is to Mother Russia, and he may see that someone replacing Putin may be more beneficial to him, or he might replace
He may
Putin.
have those aspirations himself.
And that gets
Yeah.
that gets it gets to your last point, and I'll stop here. The issue is, of course, to me, it's not whether if Putin exits the scene, it's when he exits. I think we're now at that stage. I don't think he's going to go quietly. I think he's going to go out in a box or a boom. But then what? Are we going to get Prigozhin? We're not going to get a Democrat. I mean, that much is pretty clear.
Mm.
We're going to see a continuation of authoritarianism in a different guise. The question is, will that be a liberalizing authoritarian regime that is transiting towards a more open society, which may result in democracy in 20 years? Or are we going to transit to something more medieval, hardcore, isolationist? Because there's a lot of calls that if we don't win this war, let's shut down the borders and concentrate on our internal affairs. There's a lot going on with Russian nationalists on that front. And so it's one of those things where, beware of what you wish for. We may want Putin out. And I think he's a dead man walking at this point. But then, who's going to replace him? And right now, no one has, the spine to stand up and go, well, if he leaves, I'm willing to take over, except for Prigozhin, who has made very clear he's happily ready to come in and run the show. I think Putin will try to buy him off, maybe by making him Minister of Defense, but then he's getting a little too close. That may be a means of getting him close so you can kill him off. I mean, at some point, Putin's going to realize this guy's going to do me in. And so I might as well preempt him and wear the consequences than allow him to get any closer to the levers of power by running the Ministry of Defense. But invite him in because he's an egomaniac. He'll love the attention, and then you do him in one way or another.
Clearly knows his strengths and weaknesses as well, from having known him for decades, from chef to commanding an international mercenary group that is designated by the West as a terrorist organization. So if we look at this and stand back, it's almost giving a picture where Putin, who is notorious for playing one person off against another, one organization off against another, one department or ministry against another. And we can see, that has been very much how he maintains control, that basically they sort out and do the damage to each other, and he, goes and benefits from that. If we're looking at this, if Putin senses that there is a problem perhaps coming where the Russian military at whatever level could leverage its might and its power, its influence against his regime, himself is included, then perhaps the private militias, the private armies that have been set up to look after the interests of the corporations, and in part including the Wagner Group here, perhaps that is the counterbalance to keep his own state military in check. That if you make a move here, they're big enough, they're powerful enough to be able to take you on at the very least. Secondly, by having that dynamic that does seem to be there, if you look at the criticisms that have been thrown, I put that in a tame way, didn't I? The criticisms from Prigozhin toward his state military counterparts. Then you've got a situation where it could be that no longer can the state military, be the counterbalance against a rise from the private military organizations like Wagner and others. So that seems like the counterbalance has been destroyed, if that was a tactic of Putin. And it seems like at the very least, the public sphere attitudes of Prigozhin and the Wagner Group and perhaps potentially other private military interests are now sensing that they're not just in the ascendancy, but have that ascendant position. And if that needs testing out, if that thesis has legs and has accuracy to it, but in any scenario, it seems like the damage from Putin's side of things is in evidence, and what is he going to do about it? People were calling that one question, what's Putin going to do about Prigozhin a couple of weeks ago with the challenge? Nothing really happened. That was the only explanation that had come through, that he's playing one off the other. Now it seems like over the last 24 hours, Paul, it's gone to another level. Where do we wrap this up? You know, there's so many legs to this episode, so much detail that people relating to where their interest areas are can take a tangent from, do readings on it, get opinion on it, follow that particular line. If you're looking back, Paul, how do we wrap this up? Usually I try and attempt it. I'm putting it back to you.
Okay, well, let me start by offering a broader conceptual view, just so that people realize these things don't happen in a vacuum, and there's plenty of historical evidence for what I'm about to say. I told you that, as it turns out, the problem of succession is the Achilles heel of authoritarian regimes. Okay, it's a concept in comparative politics that's been around for a long time, and I explain why. There's another one that's just as broad, which is that authoritarian regimes, when they feel themselves in trouble, tend to stage a diversion in the form of an external war against a weaker country. But that inevitably leads to the fall of the regime. The Greek colonel's regime invaded Cyprus in 1976, I believe, and were defeated by the Turks, and the regime fell. The Argentine junta in 1982 invaded the Malvinas Falklands, and as a result of their defeat, they fell. Russia is a classic example of staging a diversion by inventing a reason to invade the Ukraine, underestimating the capabilities of this weaker opponent. And he's going to pay the price. He's going to wind up being yet another example of an authoritarian who overreached. Now, tactically, what you've said is very interesting, because Prigozhin is criticizing military elites and then civilian elites, that whole anti-oligarch, fulmination. But I have no doubts, because his Wagner people fight so closely with the Russians when the Russians aren't retreating, that at his senior commander level, I'm sure his commanders are talking to Russian colonels, let's say, or colonels, majors, guys who are actually doing their service and doing it professionally. And I have no doubt that if they are talking to their counterparts in the Russian army, they are setting the stage for a transference of loyalty from Putin to Prigozhin or someone else. But they're saying, look, Putin put all these armchair generals in power. Those guys, their children are in Dubai. You guys are doing the hog slog, and you don't have the equipment. You got all this old stuff that breaks down. Why? Because the procurement process was corrupted by those guys. And so, look, we've been standing shoulder to shoulder with you against this really formidable enemy known as the Ukrainian army. How about, once this is all over, we go back home and we get rid of the bums? They can't fight. We can fight. And he may try to put up more of his army against them, but he's not left with a lot of army to give. The Russians do have their Navy and Air Force still pretty much intact. But what are you going to do? Bomb Moscow to rid it of the Wagner Group?
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
I think that for a lot of reasons, I mean, we assume that Prigozhin squawks and it's all at the leadership level. But this guy's, he's got that rat cunning. And again, because his guys have served alongside the Russians for better or for worse, I think, there's a lot of horizontal chatter between these PMCs. I'm using Wagner because they're out in the Ukraine, but these other groups that you've mentioned, I think everybody's talking to each other and going, look at, is this guy expendable? Yeah, he probably is. Now, the question is, who should replace him since he doesn't have a successor? Medvedev? Nah, not this guy. It's going to be one of us. And then what's the division of spoils? If we come in and become puppet masters or kingmakers, then what's in it for us?
And that part is really interesting, because when you consider the oligarchs under the Putin era, there is a huge network of people that are, one, dependent and one, loyal to the Putin way of things, because their everything is based on that appeasement. So for change, that is major top-heavy change that would be in evidence. And the difficulties is, while I think that regionally, within the Republic, within the Federation, that the power elites within the regions seem to have been devolved over the last 2 to 3 years. Now, that is a subjective observation that could be challenged in different circumstances. But if you were looking at, because it's a complex network of states and regions, that cries around the Russian areas. So if one gets a sense that there isn't the abilities within the federal structure for something to move from the outer areas to basically take the positions of power. St. Petersburg and certainly Moscow is still the bastions of power elitism within Russia. If there was a move that was successful that is coming out of this conflict, and the private army networks in whatever configuration are the ones that are going to institute change, I think that's where the interesting is not the right word, but the observations would be, do potential leader replacements come from that group, which seems to be absolutely frightening, or is there some sort of grouping that amongst the regional once were power elites that can rise and be placed in there in some sort of puppet kind of thing? And what I'm talking about here and thinking is a comparison to perhaps Algeria after the junta took control, and then they had their puppet presidents and puppet representatives in the political sphere in Algiers that were once controlled by the army, but now the army is not in control, as I understand it. It's more in the Air Force and the other forces areas, and that's been the change in an Algerian sense, from the point of view of all of those people that were in exile with many death sentences being able to go home and to live relatively safely. So, those kind of things placed across the area, I'm just kind of adding in a comparison sense. While they're not pure comparisons, they perhaps in certain areas have a relevancy. Paul, let's just wrap this up right now.
Yeah, let me just end with this. There's not going to be revolutionary change in Russia, because revolutionary change involves what we know as parametric change of the state and society. Revolutions are, the whole ball of wax gets changed, reconfigured. That's not going to happen. What's going to happen is, at a minimum, leadership change, and at a medium, regime change. And the scenarios where these PMCs will pick some puppet, that's leadership change. But the regime will stay more or less. It'll just have different personnel and different interests represented within it. Our hope, of course, revolutions seldom end well. They don't end in democracies. That's another thing. I mean, even the American Revolution didn't end in a real democracy. Revolutions end in another type of authoritarianism. So our best hope is regime change, where the PMCs negotiate with the opposition, like Navalny or whatever the fellow's name is in prison,
Navalny, yeah,
and say, you let us do our business and we'll let you go about your business. Understanding that for Russia's history, this is probably in its best interest. My guess is we're not going to see that. We're going to see a leadership change, and then another group of authoritarians who are less myopic when it comes to affairs outside of the Russian state. Understand, look at, if we put ourselves out into another country by force, we've learned our lesson. It's not going to end well. And so limit themselves to enriching themselves as a collective, and then doing their military type business all over the world, wherever people hire them, so that it does not impact on Mother Russia. That, to me, will be more likely the most probable solution set, given Russian mentalities in this day and age. But at a minimum, leadership changes in the offering. Once modern Western weaponry shows up in the Ukraine, be it F-16s, be it the M1 Abrams tanks, then the writing's on the wall. And it may be 6 months, it may be 9 months, it may be a year. But as I said, Putin, as far as I'm concerned, is a dead man walking.
And I'll just finish off too that what we've been talking about clearly is that primary question, that underneath this, if the measures that have been used by the Russian political scientists that are in exile in Europe mainly to try and get a sense of where the people are. And the parent generations and the younger generations are going to be the inheritors of the future that is already lapping at Putin's heels, clearly. And those value sets where they're not questioned about do they support the war, yes, no, all of this type of thing, but what kind of things are important to them. And you've got proportions of those that are saying, well, when we're in business, when we're in trade, we want it to be liberalised. And that's down, between 10 and say 12%. You've got those that are saying, well, we want a democracy, we want a social democratic kind of thing. And they're quite high in their percentages amongst the people that are not interested in conflict. You've got all of these other things like, I'm a nationalist, and they're sitting there, we want to get back to having Russia as a global power, and they've got their percentages around beneath the social democratic kind of mood of the nations. The point being here, I could rattle on a number of others, but the political scientists like Ekaterina Schulman that are in exile in Berlin, that spoke in Paris recently, they're saying what all of this makes up is the next generations that are going to have, it'll be their Russia. And they're not saying whether or not this is possible, but what they represent is basically a modern democracy of which is an evidence amongst multi-party democratic systems. That each of their areas of value were attaching to what a political party could look like. Now, they're certainly not saying that's achievable in Russia in potentially this generation's time span. But they're saying that that was an interesting thing. And I think that stood out to me, that it gets down to some absolute tin tacks, that irrespective of what is an aggressing country where the decisions of invading another are made by the political power elites, etc., as we've identified today, that doesn't take away from the fact that within the Russian people, they want their kids to get an education, they want to be healthy, and they want them to have a better future. So it's an interesting thing. I just wanted to leave it with that, Paul. And that's not taking a liberal, kind-hearted approach to this. It's a reality that is shown through in the major numbers in all of the areas that are being dissected on data by those that create their own expertise in these fields. On that, thank you, Paul, for taking us through it and unpicking the complexity here, taking a rationalist and a real consequential approach to this, what we can expect, what seems to be relevant, what doesn't, what is kind of abstract from the point of view of the power inside Russia, and what is right on the money there from that respect. For those that have been engaging here, I really want to just mention Barbara Thomas, who's been involved in the commentary while we've been talking, and also David Mooring, once again, that has been significant with many ideas. I'd stress people that are listening to this or live or listening to it on demand in whatever capacity, check out the YouTube channels. There's a lot of conversation that takes place in there, and it's a good one for engaging and taking this conversation and this issue further, and discourse is a good thing. Thank you for your attendance. Paul and I will intend to be back once again in 2 weeks' time, and we'll bring another big issue to the table where we'll discuss and drill down, and we encourage your interaction on that once again in 2 weeks' time. And we'll look forward to it. Until then, be safe, take care, and ka kite anō from Paul and I. That's another episode done, Paul.